One of the threshold concepts of our course is that writing is a process of deliberation, that it involves identifying and enacting choices, strategies, and moves. Could you all talk about, as reviewers and writers, how you experienced that process of deliberation as you were reviewing and receiving your feedback?
So as I was reading Ron's piece, I realized, this was what he felt was pretty close to completion. So as I was doing the review, I decided to act as a practice audience and just give my reactions throughout the piece.
I did the same thing because I knew when I read Clint's piece that it was a finished piece. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't in process. There were no particular areas that he had questions about. It was published, essentially. It was out there in the world and needed to have a reader to respond in that way. So it took me, and I did read it 3 times. Once just to get the sense of it, twice to look at the form and the structure, and then look at the elements that were creating the impact in the story. What were the dramatic moments? What were the strong images? What were the symbols? What was the kind of tale, and so on. So in that sense, is deliberative looking at those kinds of things.
Yeah, I would agree that I read in order to give Ron an idea of how I experienced the text, but also to suggest things that maybe I'd seen in different texts that I've read that I might have thought Ron could implement to make it more of an enjoyable experience for me to read, or just another perspective. Yeah, I would say that's kind of was my intention. Also, I did take time to read and reread the text, probably more so than the average student would take to read a text by his or her peer. I probably spent well over an hour writing comments and then also reviewing my comments to the point where I was probably reading it sentence by sentence, which maybe hindered my experience reading the text because I didn't give it a chance to be read paragraph by paragraph or just sit back and think about overall how did I experience the text. Rather, I kind of broke it down methodically to ensure that Ron had something tangible that he could use. Because my expectation was that this was a piece that he was going to revise. Even if it was a finished piece that had already been published on a blog, that he wanted, for whatever reason, wanted to revisit this text and make it suitable for other audiences.
For the reviewers, how many of you had the experience the first time you read the draft, you felt like, what am I going to say? How many of you felt like an anxiety or a distance from the text the first time through? Everybody? How did you overcome that? What were the strategies you used to be able to get into the text more and engage it in a way to give meaningful feedback?
Well, reading it again and again, not just reading it once and saying, well, that's really good, smiley face, and then moving on, but engaging with the text and reading it and just reading it the same way you would read an article for this class or any other class, and trying to get more out of it. You're always going to get a lot more out of it the second or third reading.
Well, and then, the issue of, wow, this is really good. What can I possibly say becomes then how can I explain why this is good and why I am saying this is good and how it's affecting me. So then that gave me the vehicle I needed to write the comments. Here's what I think is happening. Here's why I think it's good. Here's why I think it's working.
And then for me also then to pull back from the specific piece and to think about how does it fit into other pieces of writing that I know, which is the move that you just identified too in reading mine, but with Clint's, for me to kind of think, okay, what other fantasy pieces does this kind of remind me of, or what kind, have I seen these moves before? So to kind of think about it as a specific text written by Clint, but also as this text that's connected to other texts out there, and then how does it compare, contrast, or?
I personally question how effective my strategy was in kind of getting over the anxiety of reading a text that I initially, read through and thought, okay, this is perfectly fine. And I think my strategy again was to be very methodical and go sentence by sentence. Which
there's different ways you can engage with a text. You can engage with it sentence by sentence, and not having a comma here made me confused, and this and this and this. And you can also step back and say, okay, overall, this is what I felt. So I think there's just two those we've just shown two ways
levels.
that you can engage.
And I would say the same, I mean, to shift to the writers, but making the same kind of move, I think you can engage feedback in at least multiple ways too, in the sense that that move of like feeling kind of overwhelmed with lots of comments, what do I do? But then also kind of zeroing in on themes in the feedback, and then also connection. Like I saw, okay, Kenna mentioned this, Stacy also mentioned something like this, either good or bad, and so that I'm going to focus my attention there. And then that kind of deliberative process for me was, I mean, I guess the idea I want to try and get is that feedback has multiple functions. So part of like Kenna's feedback pushed me to, in a sense, stand up for my text, not like to Kenna, but just inside myself, right? To say, no, I believe in this part of the text, and I'm going to try. And that doesn't mean I have to say, no, I'm not going to change anything about it. But though it might mean that. But I'm going to try and make this work. Now, I believe in this part of the text. I want to make it work somehow. So maybe I'm going to shape something else about the text to help a reader like Kenna connect. But then at other times to recognize, no, this is really not working. It's not what I intended. Like I'd use the second person, which I mean, I've often told students not to make that move, or I've cautioned them, not to say don't do it, but you sure you want to do that? Why are you doing it? And I thought that I had kind of, thought through that why I was doing that, and then later realized, no, I don't think that's a strong argument. Well, I'm not sure why you use the second person. I don't think it's working the way that I wanted. And I think Kenna commented that it kind of disconnected you from the story, let us experience it our own. And I thought, yeah, I think she's right. But it took me a little while to get to that point. I did in the same way that you had to revisit the text, or we all had to revisit the text we were giving feedback on. I think you have to revisit feedback. And I also had to recognize, kind of do some internal, kind of like, oh, I'm feeling defensive. Because this is what I'm writing about here is really personal to me. There's a really important experience in my life where I had to face the fact that I was not going to be a competitor as a runner anymore, and that I had to shift. So it was really important to me. So I had to disconnect as much as I could that personal stuff that was going on to say, okay, but this is now a piece of writing for other people. It's not just for me, and it's not just for somebody who knows me well. It's for other people. And so what can I do to make it accessible?
Which is one of the things that's really jumped out of this conversation, is that whether it's the feedback or the original writing, is for other people. Right? When we talk about it being deliberative, that we're making choices, the reason why I chose to write a fable is because I knew I was in a competition. There were going to be a lot of other people who were submitting stories to this contest, and I wanted mine to be different. And so I knew that the vast majority, probably all of them, would just be stories that took place within this world that Wolverton had created. So I said, how am I going to be different? I'm going to tell a story that's told in that world, a myth from within that world. And the reason why I did it is because of the audience. I wanted to be different when Dave was looking at all of the different stories. So from the very concept was based on my audience and the situation. And the feedback, everything we're hearing is it's about an audience. Do I have a relationship with this writer? What is that relationship? How does that shape what I have at stake when I'm giving feedback? For those of us who have done the writing, how do we interpret the comments as coming from Jamie or from Kenna or from Stacy? The audience has everything to do with everything that we've talked about at every level here.
And that's absolutely one of the threshold concepts of our course, that the meanings and the effects of writing are contingent on the situation, the readers, and the text purposes and uses. And I think understanding some of these original contexts, understanding the thinking that was going on in the writing and the reviewing and the thinking and the revising is really helpful in understanding the text. So what did you learn through this process as writers, as reviewers, as teachers, any of the above? What did you learn from doing this activity of spending a semester sharing your writing and reviewing it and wrestling with the feedback?
Well, I think one thing that we can't ignore is the responsibility of the writer to the reviewer and just saying, here's what I want. I need help with this and this and this. Give me some feedback on this. And I think it's really important for that writer to ask for help and ask for what they need. And I think it's also, again, important for that writer to say, okay, now I'm going to choose based on this practice audience that I've been able to share my piece with. I'm going to choose what feedback I'm going to use and what feedback I'm not going to use. But at least I know what my audience, my potential audience, is thinking.
Yes, always be aware that it's a dialogue that's going on, that it's a conversation about writing, about revising, about what people need to use for what kind of help they need, what kind of feedback is not helpful. It's always in process that way. So that's important, that it's not coming in one direction, and it doesn't have to be taken, only at face value. There can be a conversation about it. That's useful.
For me, an overall takeaway in that is just to remind myself that what we ask students to do is hard. It's hard to give feedback. It's hard to get feedback. And even when I'm in a situation where I have a lot of experience doing that, I'm supposed to have a certain level of expertise, it's still hard for me to give feedback, that I feel some anxiety about it. And so of course students are going to feel anxiety. So it's a good reminder for me just to remember that must be really anxiety producing for some students. And I want to listen when students say, I don't know what to say, because sometimes I might think, well, are you reading carefully? Are you taking enough time? Maybe they have, and it's just they're anxious. They're not quite sure what to do because they're overwhelmed either with the task of giving feedback, or they're overwhelmed with the kinds of feedback they've received and it's caught up with some emotional things. They're not sure what to do. So for me, it's a good reminder.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's great. And it's also important to realize that we are truly meaning what we say when we're saying this is a process we're going through. It's complicated. It can be problematic, and it's not product focused only. That's what it's the process that we're valuing.
Now, that's where the meaning comes. Is
The
that
meaning
process,
comes
not
from.
that
It's
you,
what
like, say,
that's where the critical
ta-da.
learning comes. It's not about getting it right or wrong. It's about entertaining ambiguity and differences, and maybe not getting finished, but being in process. And we value that, and that's what we mean by critical thinking and engagement.
And for me, it just reinforced that when I put a text out there, there's always a deep sense of vulnerability based on how people respond to it. But having everybody who responded to the text articulate the positions that they were coming from really reinforced that there's no ultimate authority when it comes to how we're using language, right? It sometimes feels that way. It sometimes feels like the reader has all power, and because they can judge you and they can dislike what you've done, and sometimes they can reject what you've done, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. It just means that that's one response. And so the question becomes, how do I use the responses that I'm getting? And I think that it's valuable to point out that we got multiple responses from multiple people. They were all different. They were all unique. They all give us, as writers, more options. And it's our responsibility as the writer to decide what among the options that we see, including those presented by those giving feedback, do we think is going to help us to achieve our objective as well as possible.
Yeah, I would just echo what everyone else said, that writing is basically about problem solving and making choices to suit your purpose behind writing and who your audience is, and maybe even adhering to certain genres that you want to create or showcase within your writing. And there's a lot of anxiety that ensues as you write or read other people's writing with the expectation of giving them something to work off of. So that's something that takes time. It isn't something, even in a 10-10 course where you're asked to peer review online, that maybe is half an hour you sit down and you walk away and submit that review, that feedback. Maybe it's a kind of ongoing process where you take time to think about these are the comments that I wrote, these are the questions that I responded to. Now what's really going to be valuable to the person who wrote this document? You know, is it following just a set of questions, or is it looking at the questions that person may have written right before they started their essay to give you a better understanding of what he or she wants from that writing? There's a whole bunch of questions and problems you have to solve along the way as you provide somebody with useful, fruitful feedback.
So I think just the idea of going through this peer review, even in just the first part of our unit, the narrative unit, is actually going to connect throughout the semester as we do our rhetorical analysis and we think about how will multiple audiences view a particular work, and then as we move on into the semester and do our viewpoint synthesis, where we look at how can different people have different answers to the same question. So I think this peer review process is really important as we look at how different people look at different pieces of writing. It's really an important skill for critical
So not
thinking.
just in of itself, but also for that move that you're going to use it in other places. I mean, that is that ability to see different responses, and not necessarily just think in terms of right or wrong.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
And it seems like one of the things that was really valuable for you as writers was the depth of engagement that you got with the text itself.
Well, it determines how many options you have, right? I mean, Ron has talked about how in some ways Kenna's feedback was the more challenging, but I think you mentioned that in some ways it was perhaps more helpful.
Yeah, ultimately, yeah, when I revised, there was more, because there was just a lot to work from. And so even though there was a number of things I didn't follow up with Kenna's, there was also so much that I was able to follow up with some of those, yeah. Very true.
But I mean, that such a strategy does risk just that initial defensiveness never, the writer never being able to get over the defensiveness. So I don't know, I just, looking for the formula to write anything and get it right, to give feedback and get it right, is just not going to happen.
No, it's about engagement, right?
Yeah.
It's all about engagement.